Emily had always been fascinated by old houses. Growing up in a small town in Maine, she would often pass by the abandoned mansions scattered along the countryside, imagining the stories they held within their decaying walls. It was this fascination that led her to pursue a career in history, and eventually to Willowbrook. Willowbrook was an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Vermont. Built in the late 1800s, it had seen its fair share of history. The mansion had been a home, a school, and even a convent at different points in its storied past. When Emily learned that Willowbrook was up for sale, she saw an opportunity to buy it and turn it into a historical bed and breakfast. The townspeople had warned her about Willowbrook. They spoke of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and the mansion's dark past. But Emily, ever the skeptic, dismissed their stories as nothing more than local folklore. With the money she'd saved and a loan from the bank, she bought the mansion and began the long process of restoring it. For the first few months, everything went smoothly. Emily worked tirelessly, cleaning out years of dust and cobwebs, repairing broken windows, and painting the walls. She spent her days immersed in the history of the house, uncovering old photographs, letters, and artifacts that told the story of Willowbrook and its former residents. But as winter approached, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small, easily dismissible occurrences. Doors that she was sure she'd close would be open when she returned. Objects would disappear and then reappear in strange places. And then there were the footsteps. Late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the house creaked and groaned, Emily would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks on her, but deep down she knew something was wrong. One particularly cold night, Emily sat in front of the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, reading an old journal she'd found in the attic. The journal belonged to a young nun named Sister Agnes, who had lived in Willowbrook when it was a convent. The entries were filled with descriptions of daily life at the convent, but there was a darkness that pervaded the pages. Sister Agnes wrote of strange occurrences, of feeling watched, and of a malevolent presence that haunted the convent. As Emily read, she felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up from the journal and saw, for the briefest of moments, a figure standing in the doorway. It was a nun, her face obscured by the shadows of her habit. Emily blinked, and the figure was gone. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The next morning, Emily decided to explore the convent's history in more detail. She visited the town library and combed through old newspapers and records. She learned that in the early 1900s, several nuns had died under mysterious circumstances. The townspeople whispered about a curse, and the convent was eventually abandoned. Emily returned to Willowbrook with a sense of foreboding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion was trying to tell her something. That night, she had a dream. She was standing in the chapel of the convent, the air thick with incense, and the flickering light of candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. She heard the soft murmur of prayers and saw the nuns kneeling in the pews. But there was something wrong. The nuns' faces were gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. In the center of the chapel stood Sister Agnes, her face twisted in an expression of terror. She reached out to Emily, her mouth forming silent words, but before Emily could understand, she was jolted awake. Gasping for breath, Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a cold breeze and looked towards the window, but it was closed. She heard the footsteps again, louder this time, and they were coming closer. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and crept out of her room. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. Emily followed the sound of the footsteps, her heart racing. They led her to the chapel. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The chapel was just as it had been in her dream. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Emily shone her flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. She turned to leave, but something caught her eye. On the altar, there was a small, ornate box. It hadn't been there before. She approached it cautiously and opened it. Inside was a rosary, its beads worn and the crucifix tarnished. As she held it in her hand, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. She heard a whisper, soft and urgent, but she couldn't make out the words. Emily closed the box and backed away, her hands trembling. She knew she had to leave Willowbrook. She ran back to her room, packed a bag, and hurried out of the mansion. She drove to the nearest motel and checked in, too afraid to spend another night in the house. The next morning, Emily returned to Willowbrook with a local priest. She told him everything that had happened, and he agreed to bless the house. They walked through each room, canals, the priest reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water. When they reached the chapel, the priest hesitated. "This place feels wrong," he said, his voice trembling. Emily nodded, clutching the rosary tightly. The priest began to pray, his voice echoing through the empty chapel. As he did, the temperature dropped and the air grew heavy. Emily felt a presence, cold and malevolent, watching them. Suddenly, the candles on the altar flickered to life, casting a dim, eerie glow. The priest continued to pray, his voice growing louder. Emily saw a figure materialize in the shadows, the nun from her dreams. Sister Agnes stepped forward, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily stepped forward, holding out the rosary. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice shaking. Sister Agnes looked at her, her expression filled with pain. "We were trapped," she said. "The convent was cursed. We could not leave, even in death." The priest continued to pray, and the figure of Sister Agnes began to fade. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have set us free." As the nun disappeared, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The priest finished his prayer and looked at Emily. "It's over," he said. "The spirits have been released." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. She felt a profound sense of relief, but also sadness for the souls that had been trapped for so long. She knew she had to leave Willowbrook, but she also knew that she had done something important. She had given the spirits peace. She left the mansion the next day, putting it up for sale. She returned to her life, but she never forgot the events at Willowbrook. She continued to study history, but with a newfound respect for the stories that old houses hold. And she never stopped wondering about the nun in the shadows and the secrets that Willowbrook had finally revealed. Years later, as Emily sat in her cozy apartment, she received a letter. It was from the new owners of Willowbrook. They thanked her for her work in restoring the mansion and mentioned that they had turned it into a successful bed and breakfast. They also spoke of the peacefulness of the house, how it felt warm and welcoming. Emily smiled, knowing that the spirits had finally found peace. She put the letter away and looked out the window, the memories of Willowbrook lingering in her mind. The mansion had been a place of darkness and fear, but also of redemption and peace. And Emily knew that she would always carry a part of its story with her.